Yeah, it took me about four days to really
Mm.
get through it. I lost about 3 kilo.
Yeah, you're looking a bit thinner, and your voice has dropped slightly as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I rather like this deeper voice, but no, it'll go away once I recover.
Yeah. The shirt and tie and glasses as well with the deeper voice gives you a kind of scholarly prestige.
Right? I put this on just for you.
I'm flattered.
So, how are things in your neck of the woods there?
They're chaotic. So we're having to kind of restructure the way we're doing things. Um, yeah, I mean, essentially, I've had enough of this garbage now, trying to deal with this system, which is just totally, well, it's insane, isn't it? I mean, you know, all of the problems with it.
Yeah.
So but I just kind of looked at it and I thought at the end of the day, it's kind of it's about conscience, really, isn't it? And when you think about what this silence means in academia, in
Mm,
terms of legitimizing some of the most evil practices imaginable.
mm.
You know, I never imagined I'd be part of such a system. I mean, did you remember at the start of the alleged pandemic? There was, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a nurse. Was she working in New York or somewhere in the United States? And she came out quite early on in kind of March, April time, and she said, "I've become aware that I'm working for a system, a medical system, which keeps people dumb, dependent, and sick." And so she quit. And I kind of feel kind of parallel in a way. You know, I'm working for a system which keeps people ignorant, stupid, and susceptible to lies.
Mm.
I mean, who would have thought this? Um, Mike Yeadon, in his recent interview with Mark Devlin, you know, he talks all about how he was, you know, kind of Pfizer vice president for, you know, however many years.
Mm.
And now he's coming out and openly and publicly saying the drugs don't work. I mean, it's unbelievable, you know, the levels of corruption that every profession seems to have reached, and you know what the real implications for that are. I mean, it's truly staggering. But here we are. So I'm ploughing on and doing my best regardless.
Well, we're I guess we're fortunate to have met at the time that we had, and we're able to collaborate and support one another. And we're all very happy, you know, especially in our circle, very happy to see that your production has skyrocketed over the past year. It's
Yep.
really amazing what you've done, and yeah,
Yeah,
hats
I
off.
mean, in a sense, it's the result of not just the last year, but the last 3 or 4 years of working kind of quietly behind the scenes. I mean, you know, a book like the psychological operations book,
Yeah,
you know, it's not put together overnight. That took a lot of work, and with a kind of 10-month delay at the publisher end as well, even when the manuscript had been submitted, it did mean it all took quite a long time for this to come together. And then the Wall Street book just so happened to come out about 6 weeks later than the psychological operations book. So it's all kind of coming out at once now. And again, because I have nothing to lose now, in terms of an academic career, but you know, I'm increasingly free to write and publish what I want now.
mm,
So in that respect, it's quite liberating, but also quite disturbing that being part of the academic system, you feel significant restraints on what you can and can't say. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do, um, Well, I've already made a significant start on it actually, but at some point in the next few months, I'm going to release a series about academia and silences in academia, and how, in fact, it's an elite knowledge system which is tightly controlled in many ways. So it's led from the center by powerful organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, various other funding
Hmm.
organizations, and then increasingly under neoliberal management structures today, and deliberate starvation of funding to academia from governments and the public purse.
Yeah,
An academic career becomes increasingly reliant on winning funding,
yeah,
which then means that academics are increasingly forced to skew their research in the direction of where the funding is.
yeah,
And this is a major, major problem when it comes to speaking truth to power. So that's kind of how it's being driven centrally. And then the margins are policed very, very carefully. And I think some of the work that has appeared in Propaganda in Focus has done an awful lot of good to expose the way in which this works. So the David Miller case, for example, and the sheer nefariousness of the Israel lobby in getting multiple academics fired, or the kinds of issues and challenges that Tim Haywood has had to deal with at Edinburgh. These are, for example, co-opting students, for example, to speak negatively in the mainstream media. These very underhand, dirty tactics that are used to send a message and to intimidate, so that other academics understand that there are certain areas where they must not go. And it's always to do with official state narratives,
yeah.
which are carefully guarded and protected. So academics face a moral choice and an intellectual choice of, do they really adhere to principles of academic freedom, speaking truth to power, fearlessly pursuing the truth no matter where it may lead? It's fine to proclaim those ideals, but in practice, when Western governments are behaving in ways which increasingly appear to rely on deception of various forms, and military grade propaganda being deployed against their own populations, do academics then have the courage to stand up and call that out? And it appears that they do not, in the main. The entire system, unfortunately, appears to have been co-opted and captured. So
Yeah.
this is a major, major problem at this stage for academia.
It can hardly be called education.
Well, I mean, there are some skeptics who refer to the system as indoctrination, and I mean, even Chomsky was kind of pointing in that direction decades ago.
Yeah.
That's perhaps a little bit unfair, because I think the point is that there's a lot of great work that does get done within academia, um, provided it's not system challenging.
Yeah.
So all kinds of work is deemed to be perfectly acceptable because it doesn't pose a fundamental challenge to power. The problem comes at the margins, at the borders, when properly critical research really does start speaking truth to power.
Mm.
And that's where the work is closed down. And as I say, the series that I'm proposing to publish on my Substack at dhughes.substack.com in the coming months is going to be quite a long and detailed series, going through many different ways in which academia and academics are effectively silenced, and how their research is directed into certain prescribed areas which are deemed to be politically acceptable.
Yes. One of the, I guess one of the key ID features of an educated person, it seems to me, is to know not just the basic propaganda, the popular slogans and tropes that dominant institutions spin and spout off to shape our, public perception, knowledge, and awareness, but also to know not to parrot those forms of propaganda, to know not just to repeat what we're being told to repeat. After all, if we engage as citizens or as scholars in this sort of behavior, we have merely assumed the roles of parrots or ventriloquist dummies. So I'd like to first begin this discussion by taking you back to a seminal paper you wrote in 2020 for an international relations journal. The article, I think, was both a trenchant analysis of academia's unwillingness to really engage with outstanding unanswered questions about 9/11, but was also a call to action among scholars to, I think, start taking the claims of 9/11 truth seriously. Since its
Yes.
publication in a mainstream academic journal, what have you learned about your own discipline? Have you seen much movement in the field that would lead you to believe things are, beginning to change for the better? I'd like to know to what extent international relations has moved beyond simply parroting the popular corporate media tropes.
Yeah, it's not just international relations. I think it's the whole of academia, actually, when it comes to the events of 9/11. So that article from 2020, 9/11 Truth and the Silence of the IR Discipline, in some ways, it was a fairly simple article. It said, here is a mountain of evidence that contradicts the official version of events regarding what took place on the day of 9/11. Here is evidence that academics don't talk about that evidence and they veer away from it in various ways. And here are some reasons, perhaps, why that might be the case and why it shouldn't be the case. That, in a nutshell, is the structure of the article. So you're right that it was a call to action at the time, because any academic with intellectual integrity has an obligation to respond to that article. The charges that it lays are too serious to be ignored, because if the official account of 9/11 is false, then the premise for the so-called war on terror is false, and all of the horrors and the evil that have followed from that war and which have seamlessly led into the COVID operation have no sound intellectual or moral justification. So the stakes couldn't be higher. Meanwhile, there is solid empirical evidence to address, and not just a little, but a lot. And as I say in the article, I really only scraped the surface of that evidence, but nevertheless, I set out, I think, 36 different points of evidence that contradict the official version of events. Therefore, academia, given that this article was peer-reviewed and published in a mainstream academic journal, have a responsibility to respond to it. Now, it may be that I'm completely offbeat and that I've got things badly wrong, in which case academics have a responsibility to refute my article, to note how and why the claims made are false, how the evidence presented is not good quality evidence, and so on. None of that has taken place. My article 4 years and 4 months later stands unrefuted and unchallenged.
No response.
So no response. Now, I mean, this is quite extraordinary, really. And it's not only that it's not been challenged. Let me give you a few statistics. So on the SAGE website, where this article was published in the journal Alternatives, 23,200 people have viewed or downloaded this article. Now, to put that in perspective, this is just the publisher's paid access website alone. This isn't the article being freely distributed around all over the internet, etc. This is a website where you have to pay to gain access to it. So who is paying to gain access? Well, predominantly it's going to be institutions, it's going to be universities, university libraries, and so on. predominantly the readership here is going to be academic. Now, I was just taking a look at the Sage website out of interest before I came on, and most IR articles that appear with Sage journals, they'll get maybe a few hundred, maybe 1 or 2,000 views. Some exceptional articles have got kind of 12, 15,000, not many. But I've got 23,200 views. So this is a very, very widely read article. Academics are paying attention to this article. But here's the rub. It only has 3 citations in 4 years. So I'm suggesting that I may have set some kind of record here for the ratio of views to citations, because 23,200 views and only 3 citations after 4 years, that in and of itself tells a story about academia's unwillingness to defense of 9/11. It's the Third Reich. It simply will not go academic to read about it. They probably know that there's something wrong, but they lack the moral courage and the intellectual to actually address those events properly. And it gets worse because in 2022, an article was published which alluded to my article, and yet it claimed to, and I quote here, refrain from citing that particular paper so as not to legitimize conspiracy promoting content through a citation. Now, I've never seen this before. They're actually alluding to my article. They're bringing it up. It doesn't fit their framework. And so not only do they kind of bracket it off, they actually refuse to give it a citation because they regard it as conspiracy promoting content. So what goes missing here? There's no attempt to address the voluminous evidence that I present in that article. The CIA's most effective thought terminating cliche, the conspiracy theory, is duly trotted out, and academia's disciplined silence regarding the events of 9/11 goes on. So this is absolutely unbelievable to me, and it points to a real rot, actually, a moral rot at the heart of the profession, because we're not dealing here with just one subject discipline. We're not dealing here with just one university. This is the entire academic community worldwide, which will not touch the events of 9/11. And even when you have really, really obvious evidence, like the destruction of Building 7, which even a high school level understanding of vectors is sufficient to understand that the only way that building could have come down as it did is if all 81 of the core columns failed simultaneously, which obviously could not have been caused by falling debris from the Twin Towers. I mean, this is really basic stuff. What academic has gone there? Okay, you've got the Leroy Hulsey study from 2019, but that was specifically commissioned by Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. But independently, since, let's say, 2010, where is the academic literature on the events of 9/11? As far as I see, we've had a good 14-year period at least now, and there wasn't that much before then. And this refusal to ask the questions, the refusal to look at evidence, as I say, is completely unconscionable, and it's unpardonable, both at a moral level, at a political level, and above all, at an intellectual level, because this displays intellectual bad faith, simply not looking at evidence, writing it off using propaganda terms. This is the opposite of what academia is supposed to be, and yet here we are.
Yeah, it seems as though truth or empirical reality is much too hot to handle. There are more important things like streams of funding to attend to rather than, say, upholding scientific rigor.
And that's been the problem, of course, that has come back in magnified form during the COVID era, the science trademark. It's not real science, is it? It's fraudulent. It's bought and paid for knowledge, in inverted commas. And of course, we know who the major foundations are that have been funding that kind of thing. So again, this is really serious stuff now. And when you see the level of capture and leading universities as well being so deeply entrenched in this, for example, one section that I've got in this forthcoming series of mine is on the role of Oxford University. And there are multiple academics and centres and so on at Oxford, which were full on behind some of the very worst tyranny that they attempted to inflict upon us, and still are. Is so, and that's just one university. But again, it's a power center, and it has impact. The problem is that that impact is proving profoundly negative now for liberal democracy, human freedom, and many other good things.
In your latest book, you appear really determined to continue extending the scholarly inquiry into this latest major narrative to have been unleashed on the world since 9/11. The COVID-19 psychological operations in the war for technocracy. Wow. The book is a monumental achievement in terms of its depth and breadth and its analytical power to pull apart, so many of the threads, the key threads holding this flimsy COVID-19 tale together. I really love how you grounded that tale in a much larger history, very well documented across industries and disciplines and officially funded research. I thought about the title. Each word in the title, I think, really captures very nicely what this tale is really about. And so the book, it seems to take us by the hand and lead us through this veil of stories, missing pieces of the larger puzzle, partly camouflage bits and pieces of mysterious institutions and shady figures over the past number of decades, all collaborating in the interest of a singular effort to nudge and to prod, to herd humanity into these pens of technocratic control, as you use the term, over our rights and our productivity. Now, how have they managed to pull this off, in your estimation? This seems like one of the major questions that motivate the research for your book. And you offer a number of powerful pieces of evidence, among them my favorite, shock and awe, as a technique in softening up the minds of both target populations and war fighters. I can personally remember it well during my days in the military, and the utility it has in putting the minds of populations into a kind of deep haze where rational thinking is kind of rendered impotent. Can you tell us about your own suspicions about this approach to, pacifying people? How or when did you begin noticing this sort of pattern of abuse, and what sorts of research questions did that trigger for you and the writing it produced in the book?
In terms of the shock and awe dimension, I was aware of the parallels. There are many parallels, in fact, between 9/11 and the COVID-19 operation, because both are psychological operations, are forms of psychological warfare, and in certain respects, they use similar techniques. So 9/11, as Naomi Klein writes in The Shock Doctrine, was this moment of extreme shock and trauma for watching populations, and she refers to a kind of blank canvas that was created in the minds of those watching, where these new words could suddenly be written and implanted, and they stay there for a long time at a subconscious level. As this goes back, as she notes, to MK Ultra. So Osama bin Laden, the name was announced 45 seconds after the second tower was hit. Terrorism, war on terror, and all of these spell-casting words were put in at that moment. And of course, in 2020, March 2020, this was another even greater shock and awe operation that worked in many ways to disorientate the public through means of, for example, isolation and creating a new and strange and unfamiliar reality. And that was the purpose of having all of those newsreaders parroting that phrase, the new normal, the new normal, the new normal, till people are indoctrinated to believe that everything has changed overnight, just like that, just as it did on 9/11. All of a sudden, the world is just like that. It's a different place. And so we have to take all of these extraordinary measures which would otherwise not be deemed acceptable. So the parallels were there from the start, although I have to be honest, I too was knocked sideways for several months by the shock and awe operation, because that's what it's intended to do. But this has a long history in terms of warfare. So it goes back really to World War One and the idea of shell shock, which Tavistock psychiatrists such as John Rawlings Rees and others understood at the time and into the 1920s, renders victims more psychologically malleable. So that's a key insight. If you can shock the mind, then you can kind of reprogram it. And that was a founding principle of the MK Ultra experiments in the 1950s and the 1960s. Multiple ways of what Ewan Cameron, a very influential psychiatrist at the time, linked to the MK Ultra program. He called it depatterning the mind, getting rid of the normal kind of thought processes that one has, and then trying to reprogram through what he calls psychic driving, which involved just playing the same messages over and over and over for sometimes days at a time, trying to reprogram the victim's mind. Now, all of that works at the individual level, but what we see from roughly the 1960s onwards, and again with the Tavistock Institute as the focus of this, are attempts to apply similar kinds of techniques involving shock to entire populations. So in many ways, this is what the oil shocks, for example, of the 1970s were about, or the kind of false flag terrorism that we saw with the Operation Gladio terrorism, and terrorism more widely across the West in the 1970s and the 1980s. And that, of course, was known as the strategy of tension, keeping the population in a state of constant kind of stress and anxiety so that it would be willing to relinquish more of its liberties in exchange for security. And guess what? That was the paradigm then after 9/11 on a global scale, a kind of global strategy of tension. We all have to surrender rights and liberties to be protected from terrorists, even though, as the scholar John Muller pointed out in 2016, the odds of being killed by a terrorist in the West are in fact lower than being hit by lightning. But this is the way these operations work. So there's a long history here spanning a century before we get to 2020. And that really was the largest psychological warfare operation in history, deployed against populations all across the world and designed to create that moment of shock to begin pushing through these very nefarious technocratic agendas which go under the banner of the Great Reset.
Yeah. Yeah, not simply psychological operations and experimentation, but also biological, chemical, nuclear. I mean, the 20th century had it all.
Unfortunately. Yeah, and I mean, I get into some of the aspects of this in chapter of COVID-19 psychological operations and the war for technocracy, but also in my next book, just came out this week, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. And in that latter book, I refer specifically to some of the forms of human experimentation that you mentioned there. Operation Sea Spray, for example, in the United States, involved the military spraying chemicals on populations. Similar things were done in the UK off the south coast. The kind of nuclear radiation experiments that were done, for which President Clinton had to apologize in the 1990s. There's a long history, actually, of the military experimenting on civilian populations. So it should perhaps come as no surprise that 2007 and the establishment of AFRICOM, this was the final, no, it wasn't the final, but it was one of the United States unified combatant commands. And what that fulfilled, the US military at that point in 2007 had effectively claimed every region of the world. And its, I don't know, jurisdiction is the right word. But there is one of these unified combatant commands for every region of the world. 2009 set, also for the virtual space. So what we see here is the military claiming some form of control over the entire. So once you understand that that's kind of more reflective of how power is really structured in the world than the kind of cliches we hear about liberal democracy and national sovereignty and so on, then it makes sense that when you get to 2020, 2021, this worldwide experiment was carried out using novel technologies with only a few months safety data, serious questions about the clinical trials. The clinical trials themselves were still in progress at that time by their own admission until May 2023. So even they hadn't been fulfilled. This is entirely experimental. And it was rolled out to a reported 5.55 billion people.
Mm.
So that to me looks like a worldwide human experiment involving physical substances of some kind. I hesitate to call it a medical experiment because I don't think it was a medical experiment. I think it was about something else. I think that we're dealing here with military technologies. So actually, all of this is incredibly dark, or in terms of the psychological warfare, the development of the IT bio nanotechnology, many other things must go back decades. And that's exactly what I argue in the book, that essentially a transnational ruling class has been preparing for this moment since 1968 at least, and it's now being unleashed very, very rapidly upon us all. And this is a global class war, as I say in the opening sentence of the book.
Yes, that's probably the best way to conceptualize and to talk about what's unfolded, what's being unleashed on the world since at least 9/11. It's a war. What's interesting to me is that still a number of academics are either unwilling or unable to have conversations about the weapons that have been deployed, whether they're, the psychological weapons or the weapons that can only be discerned under a microscope. Not just, the conventional weapons, but the weapons that are becoming more and more obvious in the scholarly literature. People appear to be, at least in my circles, they still appear to be allergic to any sort of dialogue. Very respectable academics simply do not want to go there. I don't know if that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think this goes back in large measure to techniques developed by the Tavistock Institute in terms of group psychology. So if you can kind of structure the parameters of the groupthink in certain ways, then people do not want to go beyond those parameters. They prefer the kind of safety of the crowd or the herd. They come to instinctively kind of intuit what things must not be said. And you're quite right that there's a lot of good and well-meaning people in academia. Now, I've really enjoyed working with my colleagues, but at the same time, do any of them talk about these kinds of deep structural events and the kinds of implications that those events have in terms of our fundamental understanding of how power really works in the world? And these are questions which should be of fundamental interest in important international relations in particular. And those conversations don't take place. It's very, very interesting. Another way it works is through intellectual ostracization. So before 2020, I was routinely being accepted to give papers at major professional conferences. And from 2020 on, where I've only submitted papers about the kind of research I have been doing for the last 4 years, I've received 0 invitations. So it's kind of fascinating that there's this taboo that exists in academia. And it's a really peculiar thing when you consider that even a decade or two ago, opinion polls were showing there was quite a significant proportion of Americans who understood that there was something very badly wrong about the official 9/11 narrative. I would suggest probably the majority of people now understand that it's bogus in some way. I've seen a very interesting shift in terms of the students I've been teaching over the last 10 years or so. And it used to be the case that any mention of 9/11 was treated with the usual kind of knee-jerk response of conspiracy theory, which serves to shut down any kind of critical thinking. But in recent years, particularly since 2020, I've seen more and more students who, even without me saying anything, are completely aware and awake to some of these issues. So I think that we have a strange situation here where there's quite a large segment of society, and possibly a majority here, that understand that there's something really off with these official versions of events, the 9/11 story, the COVID story, and so on. And yet we have a specific community in academia which refuses to touch any of this stuff. And it's almost a kind of disconnect from reality in that sense. It's kind of a form of psychosis in and of itself, interestingly enough. But the fact that this can be done on a worldwide scale and that it can affect the entire profession is truly astounding. And in my book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I draw many parallels between the political economy of the 1930s and the political economy of the West since 2020. And just one of those many parallels has to do with academia, which in the 1930s was completely and utterly captured by the Nazis. Jews and Marxists and others were quickly fired. The rest of the profession soon fell in line. And again, similar principles that academic freedom existed. You can write about whatever you want, provided it doesn't challenge the regime in any way.
Yeah.
And after 1945, various former scholars in Nazi Germany reflected on what they had seen, and a number of them used the term prostitution and said how shameful it was that German academia, far from reflecting the civilized values of Beethoven and Mozart and Goethe and this kind of fine German cultural tradition, had just prostituted themselves to power. This was a source of great shame and something which the Germans really struggled to deal with after 1945. Now, the way I'm looking at it here is, what else are we talking about today than a similar kind of process where we have this abject refusal to really question power, even when the evidence is glaring, even when the evidence is stark. So I think this all has to do with a deliberately manufactured Gleichschaltung, which was the German term back in the 1930s. There's no direct translation, but a close approximation is production of ideological conformity. And this is happening and being deliberately driven through propaganda and psychological warfare, so that everybody understands that there are certain narratives and ideas which must not be questioned. And if you do, you stand to lose your business, your job, your career, etc. And that's what sends a message, and that's how it's done.
Yeah. Yeah, your use of the term prostitute promptly triggered in my memory the beast of Revelation 18, where the prostitute controls this vast empire that only turns on her and destroys her. I'm wondering, it's interesting that that symbol is so, it's a great metaphor of the times, of how so many things, so many areas of contemporary life have been prostituted and put up for sale and captured. I wonder if this is all really what we're talking about in academia, if it's nothing more than what we ought to expect in these sorts of revolutionary moments when all aspects of civilization must be shattered and distilled into camps that are obedient and overtly obedient to power, which of course reveals those camps that will not yield to systems of power. I wonder if that's one way in which we can really understand the logic that has been imposed upon us in this day and age.
Yeah, that logic is the production of ideological conformity, and it applies not just to academia, but across all of the professions. And it involves a kind of moral inversion, in a way, of people doing what they are told is the right thing and what they come to believe is the right thing, but which is actually profoundly harmful because it's simply serving power. So interesting that you go to the Book of Revelation and Christianity, because there is a deep religious or spiritual theological dimension behind all of this. Claudia Kuhns, in her 2003 book called The Nazi Conscience, really important book because she challenges the cliche that Germans were kind of simple-minded order followers. And she points out that actually that's not the case, that in order for the worst horrors of Nazi Germany to manifest, it required years of psychological conditioning and laws being put in place so that the German population actually came to believe the propaganda. And in the process, its conscience was hijacked. Many Germans actually thought that they were doing the right thing, trying to uphold the values of the Aryan race and the Third Reich and all of this. Now, unfortunately, I think we're seeing a similar kind of process in terms of hijacking of conscience. And when you look across the professions, we find doctors who, believing the COVID propaganda, were all too willing to violate the first principles of medical ethics and informed consent and first do no harm. And of course, in the Nazi era, the medical profession was the keenest to join the party. When you look at the churches, for example, in Nazi Germany, both Protestant and Catholic churches were keen to ally with Hitler, the Concordat being just the most famous example. But again, in 2020, what did we find? Churches closing their doors to the sick and the diseased. A real kind of inversion of Christianity. Justin Welby in this country talking about how Jesus would have got the vaccine, do the right thing, be like Jesus, get vaccinated. I mean, this is shocking, really, to see. Or if you look at the role of the political left and the unions, a complete abandonment of the working class. Again, this was seen in Nazi Germany, but they all lined up behind business closures, measures which were really harmful and destructive, not only to the working classes, but also to the middle classes. If you look at the state of the media, prostitution is an obviously appropriate metaphor there. Many people use the term prostitutes because that's all they are since 2020, at least. This complete subservience to power. The idea of the fourth estate has completely vanished, and the press, it really seems to have been infiltrated by a fifth column rather than being a fourth estate. You have these kind of dark actors now controlling the narratives, the Murdoch Empire just being the most obvious example. And so across multiple areas of life, we see them all falling into this ideological conformity, these ideas that can't be questioned, and these taboo topics. And the reason I wrote the Wall Street Nazi state is in it all before. We need to learn the lessons of history because we know what this is all about. We know what the purpose is. We know that it's all about manufacturing totalitarianism, and we know exactly where it leads. And in chapter 7 of that book, I spell out in graphic and actually quite horrific detail where exactly all of this will lead. So the moral dimension, the spiritual dimension, the religious dimension is absolutely central to everything that's going on. And the first step that we need to take if we are to challenge this global technocratic coup, this push for global totalitarianism, is to look, as Solzhenitsyn said, to the line between good and evil that runs through every human heart. And we all have our conscience to answer to, and we all have choices to make. And now is the time to be making them.
Yes. Yeah, I agree entirely, David. Dr. David A. Hughes, on his newest book and his forthcoming book, The Nazis and the Deep State. Did I get the...
No longer forthcoming. It's out already. The Kindle edition is already available.
Excellent. A real gem. I really appreciate the dialogue, and apologies for not being able to do this earlier, but
Oh, that's fine. Don't worry about that. We've all had a lot going on. I'll just add, if viewers and listeners want to find more of my work, then my Substack is the place to go at dhughes.substack.com. You can download the COVID Psychological Operations and War for Technocracy book for free from there. You can find out all the other information about my other book and our 4-part series on transhumanism and a great deal else besides. So please do check that out. And one final note, I guess, for viewers and listeners, it will probably come as no surprise, given the content of this conversation, that in the context of a round of redundancies being made at my university, I have now decided to take voluntary redundancy. So my academic career comes to an end. I do intend to keep doing this work because it's important, but of course, from this point on, I will need the public support to help me keep doing that work. So please do follow me. Please do take out a paid subscription if you can, or buy me a coffee, DA Hughes at buymeacoffee.com. And yeah, I'd be very, very grateful for any support that anyone can send my way.
and we'll be sure to include all those details in the show notes as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My friend, and looking forward to talking again soon.
You bet. Yeah. Onwards and upwards.
All right, David. Take care.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.